Hey everyone, it's Sebastian from the Rhythm section, and today I'm going to be reviewing the new album from The Strokes called The New Abnormal. Before we get into the review, I just want to say sorry because it's a dark and stormy night outside, and it's probably going to bleed in a little bit. Also, you might notice that I'm in a new location. I am at my mom's house now, but I've tried to emulate it as closely as possible, so we'll see how it goes. So The Strokes are an indie and garage rock revival band straight out of the Big Apple, and they're one of the biggest from the 2000s post-punk and garage rock revival scene. The Strokes first gained acclaim and popularity in 2001 when they dropped their youthful debut album, Is This It? They quickly followed up Is This It with Room on Fire, which had a similar style of lo-fi production as well as similar songwriting, but had a little bit more songwriting variety, just a little bit to keep it fresh. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a pretty close second in their discography, behind Is This It? But after Room on Fire is where the Strokes start losing me. I think their next three albums all suffer from pretty inconsistent production as well as songwriting. But as they say, it's different strokes for different folks, you know? In the last 7 years since their fifth studio album, Come Down Machine, Julian Casablancas has gotten involved with his side project, The Voids, which dropped some more experimental and political albums that I was a big fan of. And Albert Hammond Jr., the guitarist of The Strokes, continued his solo project a little bit, but I've always felt that his work was kind of generic and it's never really interested me that much. And finally, in 2020, they've dropped their long-awaited comeback album. And it's definitely a strong comeback in many respects. I think it has the best production and sonic palette since Room on Fire. And I also think Casablancas has some of his best vocal performances ever on this album. The second track, Selfless, has some really nice vocal melodies, and Julian's hitting some really impressive notes in the second verse, and the chorus is really nice too with the quick moving chords. And the lyrics are a very mature reflection on Casablancas' relationships. The single At the Door, produced by Rick Rubin, has also grown on me a lot. I think Casablancas' vocals on it are really strong, and I think the lyrics about death and loneliness are some of the most poetic that he's ever gotten on track. I also like the production and the aloof vocal performance on the opening cut here, The Adults Are Talking. I think it has a nice muted guitar sound, but while it is catchy, I think the guitar riff here gets a little old, especially as Casablancas just sings the exact same melody over the chorus. And the track suffers from an issue that a lot of the songs on this album suffer from, which is a very predictable minor 4-chord melody. It's definitely a sound associated with the Strokes, but I think Casablancas' minor 4-chord progressions get a little old by the end of the album. I think just in general, one of the main issues that this album suffers from is it sounds like they had a lack of ideas in the studio. The album gets a lot weaker near the end, with the final 2 tracks feeling really stretched out just to pad the length of the album. Not the Same Anymore features a pretty uninteresting descending guitar line and pretty low energy performances. Plus, it really doesn't help that after 4 minutes into the song, they decided to just add nothing else to the song but let it trail off for a whole minute and a half more. And Ode to the Mets has some pretty good lyrics that build on the themes of death that are touched on throughout the album. And the song also has pretty lush instrumentation and a really beautiful ending. The only issue is, after 4.5 minutes of the first descending guitar line, which is even more predictable than the descending guitar line in the last song, it feels like it really wears its welcome. And I don't really understand why the Strokes would try and pad out their songs like this either. Their most acclaimed albums are 35 minutes and 33 minutes each respectively, and this one's at 45 minutes, and it seems like lots of the minutes here are just filler. I feel like it also might have been their lack of songwriting ideas that led the Strokes to include an odd set of 3 80s nostalgia sounding songs starting at Brooklyn Bridge to the chorus. I don't hate the songs by any means, but it just seems like a curious sort of switch up to throw in there, because the rest of the songs on the album aren't super 80s sounding. But on the tracks where they do go for the 80s sound, they're going pretty hard on it. I think it's actually a bit to the detriment of Bad Decisions how hard they go on the 80s sound. The song's really energetic, it has the usual swaggy Strokes lyrics, and I really like the second section that has like these out-of-key chords that I think sound really cool. But then to not only sample Billy Idol for the chorus melody, and then also use this chorused guitar riff that sounds like so many 80s synth pop songs that I've heard before, it's just like, it feels like it's reminding me of too many things at once. Eternal Summer is probably the most left field song on the album, mostly because of Casablanca's vocal performance, in which he gives two separate vocal styles on the verse and chorus that sound equally unlike him. Casablancas has a really impressive falsetto on the verse that sounds more like The Weeknd doing an 80s throwback than any previous Strokes song, and I really like his growled, like fake British accent thing on the chorus too. I think it's pretty cool. But ultimately it feels like there's not really enough going on in the instrumental and in the lyrics to justify the slow plodding along and long track length. And Brooklyn Bridge, the chorus, is probably my least favorite of the 80s style songs and probably my least favorite on the album as well. The song features yet another pretty predictable chord progression, and I don't really like the tone of the synth that much in the verse, but it's also made even worse by the fact that the tone of the synth in the verse really doesn't complement itself very well with the guitar that enters during the chorus. It sounds like they took a bunch of different puzzle pieces of song parts and just forced them together without actually paying attention to whether the pieces go together or not. And then when Casablancas decides to be all clever and break the fourth wall and say, "Can we switch to the chorus right now?" My boy Toledo already beat you to that. But with all the filler sections, the padded out track times, as well as the kind of cheap 80s nostalgia appeals, really one of the weakest elements of the songwriting on this album is the bass lines. I think it can't really be understated how much the bass lines are just completely phoned in on this album. There's not a single melodic bass line I can remember from the album, and it feels pretty much just like the bass player was comfortable the entire time in the studio with just filling out the bottom end of whatever chord everyone was playing. So while there are some textural, melodic, and lyrical ideas that are really impressive on this album and a great return to form for the Strokes, I think they didn't enter the album with enough of these ideas. It also feels like not all the members of the Strokes are really equally invested in the band anymore. I think Casablancas is pulling a lot of the weight on this album with how emotive his vocal performances are and how poetic his lyrics can get sometimes. But overall, I think it suffers from a lot of the same inconsistency and lack of inspiration that some of the past Strokes albums suffered from. So I'm giving this new Strokes album a 5 out of 10. I definitely don't hate it by any means, but I think it really works best as background music at lots of the points, and it really is not interesting enough at many points to justify the 45-minute runtime, which isn't even that long to begin with. But if you do like the Strokes a lot, and if you did like this album a lot, then try giving this one a shot. Coney Island, baby, by Lou Reed. Doesn't really have the same 80s appeal that some of the songs have on this new Strokes album, but Casablancas has openly stated before how much Reed has influenced his vocal style, and I think a lot of the standout tracks on this new Strokes album have a similar sort of sentimentality that Lou Reed totally nails, like across multiple tracks on this album. So I think if you like this new Strokes album a lot, then you'll totally dig this Lou Reed album. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!